Greetings, Richard, and greetings to whomsoever is out there who might be interested in this series that John Fitzgerald and I and Richard and others are working on, and we've called it the Fighting Men of Rhodesia. And in the course of this, I'm going to be interviewing and chatting to some of the top soldiers from the Rhodesian War, and Richard certainly rates right up at the top there with the best of the best. So greetings, Rich. Last time we left off in Mozambique, I thought your early operations in Mozambique, I thought a good place to start would be you telling us a bit more about what you were actually doing on those deployments in the early days, in the early 70s.
Yeah, up until 1975, when Frelimo actually won independence and extensively took over Mozambique, we were operating alongside the Portuguese in Mozambique. When I say alongside, not sort of soldier to soldier, but they had like aldamentos. They had little outposts of armed, mostly conscripts, and they've been the most obscure little places. And at Mokombe, where we actually operated out of in Mozambique along the Zambezi River, there was a tiny little Portuguese outpost, and we used to use that as our HQ and do extensive patrols in Mozambique. The idea was obviously to prevent Zan insurgents from gaining access into Rhodesia in the early 70s. And to a large extent, it was very successful. We had Dick Paxton with his provost there on the runway, which obviously in the rainy season was a no-go. So very often, I remember one instance when we actually had to parachute into the airstrip, and the mud was so incredible that I actually disappeared down almost like an antbear hole, and the guys had to pull me out. The mud had literally come up to about just over chest high, you know, in the rainy season. So it was four-man patrols and doing extensive coverage of areas, ambushing, trying to locate crossing points, and eliminating many of them as possible before they gained entry into Rhodesia itself. Obviously locating camps that they were possibly setting up. And in those early days, there were some very phenomenal actual soldiers, you know, like Andy Chait and Daryl Watt, Koos Lutz, Henny Pretorius, with the sort of backbone in the SAS in the early 70s. They actually were the main driving force, should I say, in the SAS in those early 70s. And of course, Chris Schillenberg, who was doing sort of amazing work in those long-range recce's, looking for camps and things like that. Yeah.
And some of your early interaction with Chait, with Andy Chait.
Yeah, he was one of those sort of sergeants that us little troopies try to keep away of, because he was, not only did he have a legend within the SAS, but he was incredibly aggressive on the field. And I remember Lutz actually had to go back to Salisbury, and I got assigned to Chait's call sign. And in those days, the Portuguese ran hot and cold. So yes, they'd allow us to engage the insurgents at some point, and then they said, no, we weren't allowed to engage them. We were merely to observe them and things like this. And it was at the particular moment where they actually said we were not allowed to engage them. And I remember being in Chait's call sign, and to my horror, he says, well, that's not a problem. All we're going to do is we're just going to chase them down and apprehend them anyway. And I was thinking it was possibly a joke, and but he was being deadly serious. Thank God, for whatever reason, that was called off, and I was assigned back to Koos Lutz's call sign. But he was known, actually, and when you read, in fact, your books and other books about Andy Chait, he was extremely aggressive in the bush and absolutely fearless.
And a pity he wasn't commissioned. That was
yes. In fact, when I was at the School of Infantry, the course officers asked me numerous times, when was Andy Chait coming back? Apparently, he was like one of the best officer cadets that they'd ever had in the School of Infantry. And his military appreciations were very often used as examples on how to write a military appreciation and things like that. He was known to be extremely talented.
But his temper got the better of him.
He had known to have a lightning temper, and I haven't got any sort of evidence to back that, but one of the things apparently was it just got the better of him on his particular officer's course. Yeah. And yeah, it's a great shame, actually.
And he was killed in 76, I think.
Yeah, Big John Murphy and Scouts called me aside one day and just told me that Andy had been killed. It's what I find is funny with a lot of guys, a few guys that I've actually worked with, they almost have like a premonition that something's happening. And Andy actually insisted that his call sign carry more drips than normal on that particular operation. And it was the same with Ian Suttle when we did that Mutala raid as well. You know, he was telling me, he was thinking it was time to, do other things within the military and things like that. And of course, Martin Pierce going in on the chopper into contact, asking me 4, 5, 6 times how we were going to actually, what he was going to do with a bunker bomb. It's weird that they just seem to have this premonition, at some stage.
That it might be coming to an end.
Well, yeah, it's just, yeah,
very sad.
It's just
very sad.
Strange. Yeah.
Rich, it's still fairly early days, but your early externals during that period, anything that comes?
Yes. So obviously I got the tail end of those we used to call them the north of the river operations in Mozambique. There wasn't enough time to actually get broken into how to operate in a small 4-man stick, how to anti-track as best as possible, the sort of culture that they expected of you in a 4-man sort of stick, where you had to work very cohesively as a team member and got the back of everybody else. So it was basically a very good exercise for me in learning the culture of the SAS in that particular time.
And then your first big external really was into Zambia.
Yeah, what we talk about Big Bang in Zambia, with a huge arms depot, if you want to call it that, which was actually found by Chris Schulenberg on a recce with Mac McIntosh as his 2IC. And we obviously went in there, engaged the occupants that were there at the time, and Rob Warwicker was the main sort of demolition man at that particular time. I was under John Rosier's call sign, and we were like a long stop in an ambush position. We put down a couple of tank mines, and much to my horror, he said to me, right, take off your boots and walk up and down this dusty road there, obviously for camouflage, as if locals had sort of walked over the area where we actually laid these mines. That was actually after the attack went in, and then we withdrew and the charges were set. And it was such a huge explosion, they even heard it back in Rhodesia at that particular time. So it was a very successful op in terms of finding and blowing up huge tons and tons of ordnance at that particular time. Yeah.
And then, Rich, it wasn't long before Brian Robinson summoned you and sent you off to become a commissioned officer.
Well, to be quite honest, Hannes, I think I was quite happy being a corporal, with Vince Tilley, James Hayden, Billy Grant. I was having a pretty good life, actually, and really enjoying the sort of wing stagger and the corporal's shenanigans. It was actually my father, being a senior assistant commissioner of police, decided that my career should have another path. So quite frankly, I think what he did, he probably got on the telephone and phoned Major Robinson, said, I think it's time my son, pulled his finger out and did something a little bit more, up to my liking. Yeah. I mean, it's not as though I was like pushing to actually go on, on officer's course anyway. I was taken out of my comfort zone and sent down to School of Infantry, and of course did the OSBI, which is the officer selection part. And out of that, they selected the odd 10 or 12 guys that they wanted actually for to start the officer cadet training.
Tell us a bit about the course and how you got on and how long you were there for.
Yeah, it was about just over a year. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's about 13 or 14 months to be precise. It wasn't particularly easy, I'd have to say. I was thinking it was going to be more like, along the sort of a basic training, but with a lot more studying and things like that. It was absolutely 10, 20 times worse. It was the most, I've done 2 basic courses by then, and I thought I knew it all. But the shine parades there were just taking it to a total new level. It was just unbelievable. And the pressure on to obviously pass all your exams, and there was just never enough time to study because you were up 3, 4 o'clock getting ready for your RSMs, your shine parades. And at the same time, you had to actually prepare for all your exams. And you had to do your physical training and over the soul course every morning anyway. So it was jam-packed. It was just a sprint from beginning to end.
And then the escape and evasion and the interrogation, interesting.
Yeah, that was a very interesting part. Every single officer cadet that's ever been through the School of Infantry has that escape and evasion. Of course, you have a classical war phase where you study all the classical war techniques and procedures, and then you go on to your counterinsurgency phase. And part of that is actually you get captured and you put through a little interrogation. But what we didn't know at that particular time was there was a new team down from military intelligence actually, and they were like keen to try some new techniques. And I think that particular night they went a little bit too far. And it wasn't a particularly pleasant exercise, getting waterboarded. No matter which way you look at it, that's what they did. And getting electric shock from cattle prodders. And by 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, I think they were getting tired and they just wanted to get to bed by then. It was been going on all night. So, being one of the last occupants there, they were getting fed up and they were just getting extremely, I think, over the top. And a bit aggressive for, 19-year-old officer cadets, to be quite honest.
Rich, how did your sojourn at the School of Infantry end?
Well, Hannes, I'd like to be able to say that I passed with flying colours and went on to have a brilliant sort of career as a junior officer. Well, in fact, I didn't. I dropped the ball on a couple of occasions. One of them was the guard commander. I expected him, well, I didn't expect him. I told him to cover for me because I wanted to go and actually have a piss up with the boys back in Salisbury. They just come back from the bush. And unfortunately, when I came back to camp, I was docked as AWOL and put in a little prison cells there that had a School of Infantry. So that was touch and go. And I think the final coup de grace, which was actually very silly on my part, there was a dining in night, and Mac McIntosh and I decided we'd have just a few little beers before the official dining in night. And what started off as a few beers ended up us dancing on the bar in our stick boots and underwear. Why underwear? I have no idea. And we were drinking out of an ice bucket full of beer when the whole crowd actually was filing in to the official dinner.
And all the women in their finery.
All the women in their ball gowns, and all the course officers, Major Burford, who was absolutely astonished to see this performance. And by then we'd lost total track of time, and you can imagine, what went on there. And we both had official dates for that night, Mac and I. And I just remember mine just crying, calling me an absolute bastard, and disappearing into the night in a ball gown, never to be seen again. So it was back to the stocks again, in underwear and stick boots, and you can imagine the red caps actually thought this was hilarious, actually. But the next day actually wasn't so funny because it was kitted up and left, right, double quick time into the boss's office, the RSM behind me, and I got a good dressing down and told basically unbecoming of an officer general into the Rhodesian army, and you are being RTU'd back to your unit, yeah.
And what sort of reception did you get back at SAS from Brian Robinson?
Well, basically, what all the guys did that I'd been with at that stage for 10 months, when I went to say goodbye to them, they just said, remember, you'll have to salute us in 3 months' time, 4 months' time when you see us. And they all had a good laugh and slapped me on the back and told me what an idiot I'd been, right? Which was obvious. So when I got back to the SAS, I thought I could sneak back into the Corporals Club and just, have a few beers with Grant and King and Hayden. But it wasn't meant to be. I got Mike Curtin, actually, Captain Curtin, said to me, boss wants to see you. And, same Major Robinson tore a strip off me. It's pretty apt, actually. So he said, I'm putting you back in the bush for the rest of your contract, and you're not going to come out. And that's exactly what happened. So it was back to the bush again, back in Mozambique again, in my 4-man stick.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it was so close to the end, I thought I had it in the bag, Hannes, to be quite honest, but I dropped the ball and that was it, yeah.
And then, Rich, I don't know, you just got a bit restless and thought you needed a break. You were offered a diver's course, but you just needed a break, change of scenery.
Yeah, Bob McKenzie. Yeah, and then what was happening was I came to the end of my 3-year contract, and Bob McKenzie came to me and offered me he said, look, if you signed on again, we'd send you down to Simonstown to do the diving course, which is right. Everybody wanted to go onto that course. But what was happening is, after the members were doing the diving course, there were a few of them were going overseas and diving on the North Sea, like Shane Berry, John Rossiter, people like that. Of course, they were diving in the North Sea, and it sounded tremendously exotic, So I actually wanted to go and try and get onto the oil rigs as a roustabout and see how things went. So I actually went up to Aberdeen with Vince Tilley to try and get on the rigs, but unfortunately wasn't able to at that particular time.
Okay.
Ben Gunn was diving up there at the time, the same Gunn that owns that beautiful lodge in Botswana.
Right.
So there were quite a few SAS guys once that left, went to the North Sea and did diving in the early 70s and mid 70s. Yeah.
Okay. All right, Rich. I think we'll end it there for now, and we'll chat in a few days' time and pick up with your return.
Sure.
Rhodesia and rejoining, going into the
this part, the rejoining of Selous Scouts with Schulenburg, small teams, whatnot, will probably be the most interesting for people. I imagine the Selous Scouts, because this is the part that no one knows about. Everyone thinks they know about Selous Scouts, but they know jack shit about it. And obviously with the Schulenburg, Callow, John Gardner with his recent book, who was there, part of that small teams, and how phenomenal that was. And then I'm going to bring in how phenomenal the black troops were there, and how, they had almost complete authority on a par with us in terms of on planning and allowed to do stuff. Because I've heard some criticism that, 40% of Rhodesia was black troops, but whites still called the shots everywhere. Not so in the Selous Scouts. It was a different organization completely. So that will be probably the most interesting, I think.
Really look forward to picking up with you in a few days' time on that and continuing this discussion. Yeah. And just in case anybody's interested, the book is going to be ready in 2 weeks' time, I think.
Oh, wow.
Men of War. There is a link here somewhere, and I think there is a contact details for anybody interested in the book that Richard and I have just done, called Men of War, and lots more interesting stuff in there. But Rich, thanks for your time, and
Welcome.
Thanks, Hannes. We'll be in touch in the very near future. Cheers for now.
Cheers, buddy.